Hey everyone, Delve here. Today I'm going to do a tier list for all the races in Oblivion, and I intend to do a full series on all the tier lists in the game. These tier lists will all be based around the max difficulty, of course. Note that Oblivion Remastered may have some differences to the original Oblivion, and this guide is going to cover the original Oblivion. At some point I will, of course, go over the burst signs, and the skills, and the attributes and things like that, but today it's just the races. So races are obviously how we're going to start because that's the first choice that the game has you make, and the main criteria that matters for race is whether or not they can get you through the tutorial easily. As even in the tutorial, combat can be extremely punishing on max difficulty. The second thing is whether or not the race somehow enhances or enables your character via its racials or skill bonuses or whatever. For some skills, you will need to be a certain race. For some skills, it doesn't really matter that much. So there definitely is a way to make any race work, but some are absolutely better than others. I should mention that male and female characters have slightly different stats, and I may take that into account a little bit, but stats don't matter too much, so I won't really focus too much on that. And we'll just go in the order the character creator presents the races. Now as for the tier list itself, I only have 5 tiers here. I think it's not fair to give any race anything lower than a D, because you absolutely can make any race work. And there just aren't that many races in the game, so I think it makes the most sense to have 5 tiers overall. As for the criterion, S and A rank are much stronger than your other options. B rank is average races that can do some unique stuff. C rank is for races that have some generically decent stuff. And D rank is for the races that essentially contribute nothing to your character via their race or are harder to make work. First up is the Imperial. Looking at their stats is pretty sad. Losing out on agility, speed, or willpower is pretty lousy, although not insurmountable. But then gaining personality is pretty abysmal, so their stats are absolutely terrible. Maybe some ultra fringe use for this, but it's as niche as it gets. Their skill bonuses are also pretty terrible. Speechcraft and Mercantile are pretty useless skills. Weapon skills are also pretty lackluster in this game as well, so their only really interesting skill is Heavy Armor, which is fine, but it's the sort of skill that only really works in conjunction with other skills, but still not great, so they aren't winning in the skills category either. Now, of course, they have 2 greater powers. One is a Drain Fatigue spell, and the other is a Charm spell. The Drain Fatigue power sounds cooler than it probably is. On max difficulty, I never think to myself, I'd like to drain my enemy's fatigue. Maybe it could be used on a monk-style character, since enemies do get knocked down once they run out of fatigue with hand-to-hand attacks, or just in general. But on max difficulty, that probably just isn't ever going to make the difference. Even using it on the tutorial rats, it doesn't really keep them knocked down for very long. And if you are feeling like reducing an enemy's fatigue and knocking them down that way, there are better ways to do it. This power is by far the most interesting aspect of the race, and it's gimmicky at best. Now the Charm power is decent, and it can be used to pretty easily complete random quests with NPCs, but also totally unnecessary, and Charm spells aren't exactly the toughest spells in the game to find and cast either, so that's pretty poor as well. So I do have to give Imperial D tier, in the running for the worst race in the game. Probably not, actually, but very close. Next is Khajiit. The stats here are pretty unimpressive. Bonus agility makes you harder to stagger, and that's about it. But it's also not useless. Losing willpower is also pretty terrible, though. But just like Imperial, these stats are nothing insurmountable. We have some okay skill bonuses. I actually really like Sneak and Security. Those are actually quite useful. The rest are very lousy, especially plus 10 to hand, which is probably the worst combat skill in the game. But I guess if you wanted to use it, at least you'd have to grind slightly less. But keep in mind that this is not Skyrim, and Khajiit have no bonus innate hand-to-hand damage, so Khajiit is most certainly not the best race in the game to play as a monk with. That's because they lack good powers, so they do have a Night Eye lesser power, which is fine. You can always see in the dark, I guess. But that's actually a pretty easy thing to get in other ways. Their other power is a Fear power, Fear being the worst kind of mind control spell in the game, probably. It causes enemies to flee from you, which is more obnoxious than anything else, and attacking a fleeing enemy will eventually cause them to start attacking you again, so it kind of just does nothing. Although, it can help a tiny amount in the tutorial. I'd say it's not quite as bad as the Imperial, just because the Fear spell is maybe useful, but also it's practically speaking just as bad. Also D tier. Okay, next is Nord. A bonus to strength is really nice, especially in exchange for a hit to personality. You are losing out on intelligence, so it's not necessarily ideal, but a good number of solid spells actually don't require that much magicka, so you're not locked out of spellcasting completely or anything like that. Next up, the skills are pretty nice as well. Bonuses to armor, block, and heavy armor are across the board good for anyone trying to survive, or trying to make a melee character work. And they also start with 50% resistance to frost, which absolutely does come up against ghostly enemies, so that's also a solid bonus, even if it isn't always useful. But the powers are where Nord really shines. 50 points of frost damage is only okay, but it's helpful early on, even after the tutorial, against low-level enemies. And as long as you are staying low level, it never really completely falls off or becomes useless either. So it's a great power, although not the best in the game. And then 30% shield for 60 seconds is also extremely good. It means you only need 55 additional shield to hit the cap. And that's extremely good for surviving enemy attacks, whether at high or low level. I'd say it's a very solid B tier race, and it's an easier start than most, and good for some melee stuff or any character who's planning to take damage. Okay, next up is the Orc. The Orc stats are actually pretty interesting. Bonuses to strength, willpower, and endurance are really nice, and losing agility and speed are a really good trade-off for those. Unfortunately, losing speed could affect your ability to run past certain enemies in some scenarios, so certain tricks like the Umbra trick could become harder, where you lure Umbra up to the Imperial City to steal her weapons and armor. So in many cases, that is a major detriment, but it's probably fine for most things. Your armor is always going to weigh you down more than a small decrease to your speed. For the skills, these are actually really good. Huge bonuses to armor, block, and heavy armor are nothing to sneeze at. In fact, I'd argue these are massive benefits. All three of those skills are a huge pain to level, and getting a jump start on that is arguably more valuable than even some spellcasting skills, since you need 50 armor to repair enchanted armor and weapons, and you can gain huge amounts of defenses out of the other two. So very convenient skill spread. And they also have an innate 25% resistance to magic. This is also ridiculously good. This makes it much, much easier to get really high resistance to magic, which renders spellcasters and even enemies with reflect spell just completely impotent. 25% isn't that much without potions or enchanted armor or whatever, but any amount does help, as being resistant to magic really does count for something. And then of course their greater power, which fortifies a bunch of their melee stats, and also drains agility. Now draining agility is pretty bad, because it makes it more likely you'll get staggered in combat. Now that is actually really bad, and can really be the difference between losing and winning a lot of fights. But fortifying your fatigue by 200 points will increase the damage of your attacks, and you can use this to punch your way out of the tutorial and stuff like that. By no means the strongest racial power in the game, but also very serviceable. Ultimately, I think Orc is a race that deserves A tier, good powers for the early part of the run, pretty good stat and skill distributions to help you get going, and magic resistance to help you approach the endgame. Very strong race overall. Next is the Red Guard, and for the stats, bonus endurance is quite nice. That will make you more durable, although less casting stats is somewhat punishing. The skills are also fine. Athletics is tough to level up, so I guess that's something, but other races have the bonuses to blade, blunt, and light armor, so it's not incredible in that respect. It does also have 75% resistance to disease and poison, and that's pretty poor overall actually, but it is fairly convenient. And then of course the greater power. This is the best melee buff racial power in the game, and it comes with a hefty bonus to strength, speed, agility, and endurance, as well as health, so practically maxing out all of those stats. Not at all a bad bonus, especially for a low-level character, maximizing the physical damage from stats, and makes you harder to stagger. This is simply the physical damage character power, and it's the sort of thing that makes a lot of fights effortless as long as you are low level. You could also very easily do things like a bow-based character with certain enchanted bows or conjured bow, and make that work, and this would help that as well. So maybe there's some bias, but I think this race is B tier, just below the Nord. I think the Nord wins out because of the shield power, and the bonus to the armor skill. But I am very personally fond of the Red Guard race, and way underrated in my opinion. Can help you enable some physical damage stuff, or even just help you move around faster, so it's not at all a bad start. Okay, next is the Wood Elf. Losing out on strength and willpower is pretty lousy, although it's not as if agility and speed are useless or anything like that. Pretty middling, but not the worst by any means. The skill spread is pretty okay as well. Acrobatics is tough to level, so a boost there is nice. A boost to alchemy and alteration is also quite nice. Those are really good skills to get to 100, and light armor is okay. Tough to level, so it's not the worst thing in the world to have a boost there. It also has 75% resistance to disease, nothing to write home about, but convenient at the very least. Now their greater power is probably the most interesting one. Command creature 20 points for 60 seconds on target. This is one of those things that is useful in tons of scenarios, and it can be used in the tutorial against the tricky rat enemies, for example, You may of course assume that it's only wild animals, like bears and lions and wolves, but no, it's anything that isn't a humanoid. It's a perfectly good power you could use extensively if you wanted to. Very strong, but it just can't help you all of the time. So I'll give Wood Elf C tier, not at all a bad race, has some tools and benefits, certainly head and shoulders above any of the D tier races. Okay, next is the Argonian, and the stats are okayish, I guess. Losing personality doesn't matter at all, but losing endurance hurts a little bit, especially when the damage you're taking is so high. The stats they gain are fine, but nothing really crazy either. The skills are fairly decent too. Bonuses to alchemy and illusion are really nice. Those are very good skills. And athletics is fine as well. They also come with poison immunity and 75% resistance to disease, both being quite convenient. Unfortunately, enemies don't really deal poison damage. Only the player does in most cases, so it's something that prevents your stats from getting drained, and not really much else. But maybe it'll stop you from getting paralyzed at some point or something like that. Unfortunately, they have no greater powers, which is really what cripples them as a race. Instead, they have innate water breathing, which I guess would be okay, except that water breathing potions can be bought easily from lots of alchemy vendors. It does give you access to some decent items and access to certain areas, but without a greater power, you'll struggle immensely to fight your way out of the tutorial, let alone against any early game enemies, like imps or whatever. So I have to give them D tier, probably the worst race in the game. You can still make it work, of course, but it also just does absolutely nothing for you either, so there isn't even a compelling reason to try. Okay, next up is Breton. Breton gains a bonus to both intelligence and willpower, which are really nice stats, especially with a bonus to both of them. That helps spellcasters a lot. Losing some endurance hurts, but it's not the end of the world, especially since their race is obviously spellcasting focused. The skills are also quite good. Alchemy, Alteration, Conjuration, and Illusion are all really good skills. Very much worth having bonuses to any one of them, much less all of them, which puts you in a perfect position to cast whatever spells you want, basically. They also get a plus 10 bonus to Restoration, which is a notoriously difficult skill to level, so that's another amazing bonus they get just for free. But even more shocking than the skills is their 50% resistance to magic, which is just crazy. This is probably the single best feature of any race, period. That's halfway to just being completely immune to all magic, and even at low levels it can help you just shrug off spells that would otherwise be a problem. If you add basically any magic resistance to this character at all, such as from high-level sigil stones, suddenly magic almost does nothing to you. And then for the powers, we first off have plus 50 magicka. That's also just crazy. That's like the third best thing that any race gets at all. That's equivalent to 25 points of intelligence, or an endgame sigil stone enchantment, so you barely even need to worry about your magicka at all. And this opens up so much spellcasting, it's downright crazy. For low-level characters, as well as even high-level characters, 50 magicka is actually quite a bit. And to top it all off, they do also have a greater power too, and that is they have 50% shield for 60 seconds on self, and the armor cap is 85. So, just by picking Breton, you are decently close to having maxed out armor for 60 seconds, which is just crazy. This race is basically insane, and easy S tier. It's the only S tier race, I think. It just makes almost everything easier. You can play as like a Spellblade and cast spells in melee. You can be a pure wizard, basically whatever you want. And the thing is, even if you don't want to focus on magic exclusively, and you want to be like a warrior or rogue or something, the magic resistance makes it so much easier to play as that kind of character, and then just augment it with spells, things like Alteration, Restoration, whatever, because suddenly, you don't have to take the Atronic Burst Sign to be resistant to magic. More on that in the Burst Sign tier list, but this is undoubtedly the strongest race in the game, in my opinion. Okay, next up is the Dark Elf, and the stats are okay. Bonus speed is fine. The stats you lose aren't really too big of an issue either, I think. For the skills, a bonus to plus 10 destruction is quite nice. That's a bit of a tougher skill to level, and the rest aren't bad or anything either. Bonus to athletics, light armor, those are okay. It's an alright skill spread. And then you have 75% resistance to fire, also really great. It just means any enemy spellcasting fire spells is just doing way less to you. Unfortunately, it's not that useful in many respects. Most of the really dangerous caster enemies favor shock and frost, and so it won't necessarily come up all of the time. Even for low-level enemies like scamps, yes, they do love to cast fire spells, but also their melee attacks are far more dangerous anyway for a low-level character. Now there is the Fire Atronak, which is a somewhat common enemy. Obviously that loves to cast fire spells, but in Oblivion in general, It seems like there's sort of no room for middle-level characters, and the Fire Atronach is kind of a mid-level enemy. They show up a lot around like level 10 and stuff. So usually you're focused on very low or very high-level enemies, and there just aren't tons of enemies that exclusively cast fire spells in my experience. So ironically, I think it's arguably less useful than the Nord Frost Resistance, when you are going to be fighting enemies like ghosts from level 1 all the way until really high level. But it's not bad or anything either. Fire spells do happen occasionally, so it is an upside. They also come with the Summon Ancestor Spirit Greater Power, which just summons an allied ghost for 60 seconds. Since it's a greater power summon, the ghost itself actually scales a little bit with your level, which actually makes it a fairly decent combatant. As you level up, it mostly becomes just a distraction for enemies, but you totally could build a character around the summon to a certain extent, although it doesn't really do anything that a Conjuration summon couldn't, other than it costs no magicka. All in all, it's a very good power, very useful, and it can probably enable a lot of strategies if you use it correctly. So I'll give the race high C tier. The reason this race isn't higher is just because it basically doesn't specialize in anything too hard. It doesn't have huge bonuses to magic or huge bonuses to melee or anything like that, and it doesn't really enable any super weird strategies or have anything insanely overpowered about it either. But it is also a very solid race with good racial powers, and I'd say it's probably better than Wood Elf, if only just a little. And for our last race, that's High Elf. The stats are all right, pretty good even. Bonus to intelligence is nice, and losing out on some strength, speed, or endurance is just fine for a spellcaster character. The skills are also actually really good. Bonuses to alchemy, alteration, conjuration, destruction, and illusion are all quite nice. Really great spellcaster skill spread. Now they do have a 25% weakness to fire, frost, and shock, which is pretty lousy for max difficulty. It just means even weak spells can potentially be quite dangerous. Although some spells will one-shot you no matter what you do basically, so there's plenty of scenarios where it's not even really a detriment. Also, there are ways to become immune to magic, so you can of course write these off in the endgame. Not as big a deal as you might think, but also not good by any means either. And they also have that 75% resistance to disease. Again, this is convenient, but not really good either. Now they have no racial power, but they also have 100 extra magicka, which is probably the second best perk for any given race. And that's a lot. That doubles your magicka pool right off the bat. So if your whole strategy is to cast a whole bunch of overpowered spells, they got you covered. On top of that, they also have the greatest default height, which I haven't talked about until now. Basically, each race has a height value, and the races with a higher height value move just faster for some reason. It multiplies their speed or something. And High Elves have the biggest one of all the races. Obviously, that means that the shorter races also move a little bit slower, but I actually don't think that's that huge of a deal, really. But automatically moving the fastest to start is actually really nice, and the higher your speed is, the faster you do end up moving in the long run, too. So, a great option to consider for like speed running or just trying to move faster and stuff like that. So, easy A tier. Moving faster is nice. Bonus magicka is really, really good. A lot of very cool stuff you can do with this race for sure. Very much just behind the Breton. I'll give it A tier. Okay, so that is the races tier list for max difficulty. Again, the top two tiers are races that come with tremendously meaningful bonuses, and the B tier is for races with certain relatively specialized advantages, and the C tier is for the races with decent enough powers. D tier is for races which essentially offer nothing of value. You could very easily make the argument that the C tier races, Dark Elf and Wood Elf, are better than the B tier races because their powers are quite strong, but not enough to really change anything, while the B tier races have powers that are more specialized. But in my opinion, I like the very unique traits offered by these two races, the B tier races, over the C tier races, which I think are more generic. Spellcasting is of course very powerful as well, so the best spellcasting races sit at the top, and so I think races which at least have a melee niche are better than races which don't. So that's why the B and C tier are the way they are. That's actually kind of a controversial opinion on my part about the B and C tier being where they are, but I do value that melee potential that the B tier races do have. Anyways, thanks for watching, and of course I'd like to give a special shout out to the Old Knight, as well as the UASP and fandom wikis. Without any of these sources, none of this would be possible. And again, thanks for watching.